Welcome to People Behind the Impact, a podcast from Fordham University's Responsible Business Center at the Gabelli School of Business. I'm your host, Mark Siegel, and in this series, we talk with leaders whose work sits at the intersection of business, sustainability, reporting, governance, and long-term value creation. In prior episodes, we spoke with Barbara Porso, Associate Dean of Gabelli and leader of the Responsible Business Center. We also had a great discussion with Jeff Hales of the University of Texas and the International Sustainability Standards Board. So if you missed either of those episodes, please go back and have a listen. Today, I am super happy to welcome Andrew Jones, PhD. Andrew is a principal researcher at the Conference Board Governance and Sustainability Center, where he leads research and thought leadership on corporate governance, sustainability, and corporate citizenship. His work focuses in particular on AI governance and oversight, sustainability and disclosure trends, board governance and effectiveness, DEI and corporate citizenship, and the wider legal, regulatory, and political shifts shaping how companies respond. He regularly advises senior executives in their teams, moderates and speaks in internal and external events, and comments in leading media outlets. Andrew joined the Conference Board in 2022. Prior to this, he was a senior specialist at the World Bank and an assistant professor at the University of Warwick. He holds a PhD in modern history from the University of Birmingham. Andrew, thanks so much for joining me. It is so great to welcome you to the podcast.
Thanks so much, Mark. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion today.
Awesome. Let's get started. Maybe before we get into AI and sustainability, can you tell us a little about your career path? I mean, you've got a PhD in modern history. You spent time at the World Bank and as a professor. And so how did those prior experiences lead you to the Conference Board?
Sure, I'm delighted to. And as you know, Mark, career paths are always, don't always run smooth, right? And I think it's perhaps only in hindsight you can connect the dots and it all sort of looks coherent, right? But so I think for me, I've done a lot of stuff, as you said, I've been sort of in British academia, worked in sort of the international development system, now at the Conference Board. So it probably looks quite non-linear. But for me, I think there is a through line in all of that, right? Which I think is kind of probably how, in different ways, in different contexts, how institutions are responding to major changes, right? Whether it's major social changes, economic changes, political changes, I guess now technological changes as well. So yeah, I started out in academia in the UK. That was always really my passion, was always research and the humanities. And I studied history as an undergrad. And my doctoral research, which is at the University of Birmingham, was on the contemporary history of global humanitarianism and global development, right? And international NGOs. So I was really interested in, I guess, in how that whole sort of, how the global aid system and the broader sort of global governance infrastructure sort of evolved and evolved, particularly in the sort of latter decades of the 20th century. So that was really what I worked on for many years. But I think sort of after my PhD, so my interests probably became a bit less sort of purely historical, a bit more interdisciplinary. I was very interested in climate and development and inequality and trust, none of which really necessarily fit into one discipline. And I think that gradually pulled me more towards sort of applied work. And I left the academy. I spent a number of years working on sustainable development, which was sort of right after the SDGs, really sort of, in that peak moment, where a lot of energy and vibrancy, right? And I really focused on a few things, but a lot to do with sort of climate smart infrastructure and urbanization in sort of emerging markets in Africa and Asia. And that included a few years at the World Bank, as you said in your introduction, which is really fascinating work, helping sort of get some of these projects off the ground. So that experience all kind of brought me closer to some of these big institutional challenges, right? Like how do you mobilize capital, right? How do you build markets? How do you structure incentives? I think that's probably what ultimately led me to the Conference Board, right? So in the Conference Board, for those who listening and maybe don't know, a very interesting organization, right? We have a long history. We are a business membership organization. We're also a think tank. We sort of sit, I think, at the intersection of research and practice, where we're not purely academic, but we're not advocates or consultants as well in the conventional sense. What we really do is we help senior business leaders across all kinds of functions understand complex issues. And yeah, within TCB, I'm in the governance and sustainability center. So as the name suggests, focus on ESG, corporate governance, sustainability, citizenship, which I think became a kind of natural, or at least I hope became a natural home for the kind of work I've been doing, and still in a different kind of way now, much more of a big business lens, but hopefully still asking some of the same questions I started out with. But, it's always interesting to reflect on your trajectory, right, Mark? And maybe I've imposed a coherence on it there that it didn't have when I was working my way through it.
Yeah, I agree. Like, none of us suffer from the linear type of career trajectory. It's much more serpentine, as you pointed out. That interdisciplinary type of thoughts and work definitely resonates with me. And you seem to work at the intersection of governance and sustainability and corporate citizenship, and now AI as well. And those kind of appear at first glance to be separate fields, but how do you see them fitting all together?
Yeah, it's a great question, Mark, because within our part of the conference board, they are separate worlds, right? And they have their own audiences and their own leaders and their own cultures, but they also do fit together in some, or at least overlap and intersect in some quite interesting ways, right? So I think for me, I probably see them in very different ways, right? Connected by some of these core questions, right? Around how do companies govern, I guess, their responsibilities or their risks in a complex environment, I guess an environment that's becoming more complex as well, right? So whether it's sustainability, I guess asking how companies manage environmental risks or corporate citizenship, asking how companies, I guess, contribute to communities and societies and manage some of those social risks, or obviously governance, very much focused on boards and management, sort of overseeing all of that credibly. And I think AI fits into that and overlaps and layers in interesting ways, because I think as we now all see, it's no longer just, if it ever was, just a technology issue, right? I think it's raising questions about accountability and risk and environmental and social impact across the board, right? So yeah, I think those do all fit together in an interesting way. And I think interestingly, the language of ESG might have given them some sort of coherence as well as an umbrella. I think we've now moved away from that language, but I still think they converge in interesting ways. Don't want to overstate as well. I think interesting convergence for sure.
Yeah, I think there's so much you said there that we'll try to unpack as we go through this and address some of those different specific topics that you mentioned. But I had just a slightly different question as you were mentioning all those items. It occurs to me that you and the conference board generally sit sort of adjacent to the C-suite. And some of the topics in particular that you're focused on in the Governance and Sustainability Center can be pretty polarizing right now, as you alluded to. How do you approach topics like sustainability, DEI, climate, and AI, where the public debate can be pretty polarizing?
That's a great question, Mark. And I think, to be candid, this is a genuine challenge, right? I think it is. I think those topics you just mentioned, right? They're business issues, but they do sit inside or are shaped by, broader political debates, but also in cultural and social debates as well. And obviously part of the reason they've become polarized, I think it's one, we live in a polarized society, but two, they do touch some of these big political questions, right? About whether it's about the role of business in society, right? Or how should business at all be responding to, whether it's climate risk or inequality or technological disruption? I think these kind of questions inevitably attract scrutiny from all kinds of stakeholders, right? Including activists and political officials and the courts, right? So it is a challenge. I think there is a political milieu around all this, right? I think for us, we take pride in being nonpartisan, in being non-political, in trying to be dispassionate and really focus on, I think, evidence and data. And I think we always sort of aspire to try to avoid, as much as we can, importing some of that debate into the corporate setting, right? And I think for us, our members and the wider private sector needs practical analysis, right? It doesn't necessarily need slogans, but it is a challenge. And, I'm sure as you've seen too, Mark, right? There's been a lot of backlash in the last few years, and where it's backlash against ESG or backlash against certain aspects of E&S, and it can make the work difficult. I think we just have to sort of understand it, separate the signal from the noise, and respond in a disciplined way as much as we can.
I think that's right. I mean, I think, you and I have talked about this offline, just trying to adjust language and changing vocabulary. And what you've been doing is giving voice to help companies navigate through this as well, because they're seeing the same challenges that you and I are seeing, right? And they're trying to figure out how to do this. So I think it's extremely important work that you've been doing, and I admire it. Let's talk a little bit now about the sustainability reporting and what I call responsible reporting. And you've done work on sustainability and disclosure trends, and I've attended one or two of your excellent roundtables on this. From your vantage point, where are companies right now on sustainability disclosures? Is anybody advancing them, or are they pulling back? Are they recalibrating, or all of the above? And I guess along the continuum, where are companies between greenwashing and green hushing?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question, Mark. It's a big topic, right? And then it's a topic you have a lot of expertise and wisdom in. And we should say, you mentioned our roundtables. You've been a fantastic contributor at some of those roundtables. So thank you very much. I think for us, and I should add, we have some benchmarking capabilities of disclosure that I think we've developed at the conference board. They're quite sophisticated. We're looking at big groups of US public companies. I think it is probably all of the above things you mentioned, right? Kind of at the same time, but recalibrating is probably, I think, a fair assessment, right? And I guess, to be candid, there has been some pullback, right? I mean, and to give you some hard data, through our benchmarking capabilities, we were able to track last year the number of Russell 3000 companies, right? So kind of a big slice of corporate America, that put out an annual sustainability report compared to the year before. And actually that number fell by about 20%, right? So about a fifth. So some contracting of disclosure, right? I think that is, it's not a majority, but it is significant. But it's interesting when we dug a little deeper into that data, that fall was really concentrated amongst sort of smaller and mid cap firms, right? We actually saw a very little shift in larger cap firms where I think sustainability reporting has become routine. I think there's significant depth to it. Basically, virtually all large public companies are disclosing on emissions and climate risk, for example. So I think the real story there is perhaps not that sustainability reporting is fading or being eroded, but I think it's perhaps that it's been institutionalized at the larger companies, while perhaps some of the smaller firms are perhaps more likely to reassess, what's the cost, the risk, the value of such reporting in to be frank, a less conducive political and legal environment. So it's an interesting moment in sustainability reporting. I think more broadly, we're probably seeing a shift as well from quite expansive, aspirational ESG storytelling to something that I think is maybe a bit more controlled, evidence-based, defensible, legally reviewed, right? So I think that probably reflects a broader trend in the whole sustainability space, if I'm honest, as it matures and as some of the assumptions that change about where it's about policy, where about technology, etc.
Yeah, it was fascinating following your work over time, over 18 months or so. And you were very quick to notice that companies were at first just slowing down their ESG reporting and almost waiting for what the rest of the market is doing so that they could benchmark as they go. And then deciding, okay, well, we're going to be reporting something now. Let's figure out the content that goes in it. What I asked you was sort of as of a point in time, where are they now? But it's also, I would encourage people to follow your work so that you could see over time how those trends are developing. And you mentioned climate, so let's drill down for a second on climate. And you've looked specifically at climate disclosures across the Russell 3000 and S&P and the GHG reporting targets, regulatory preparedness, board oversight. What are companies getting better at with respect to climate disclosures specifically, and where are the persistent weak spots?
Sure. I think climate disclosures are fascinating area, right? It's probably one of the areas I really find interesting and you can sort of endlessly drill down, right? And there's more depth to it. I would say, perhaps talking in the broad sense, I think companies as a whole, and particularly the larger companies, multinationals, have got much better at measuring and disclosing greenhouse gas emissions, right? Particularly scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. Virtually all, like to use it, for example, the S&P 500, right? I think like over 90% of S&P 500 firms are reporting on scope 1 and scope 2 greenhouse gas emissions, right? And they're increasingly starting to use external assurance and auditing to verify those numbers and put some more sort of financial muscle behind it, right? Many are disclosing on board oversight of climate. Many are connecting climate to enterprise risk management. So, and as you know, Mark, a big driver, a lot of this is sort of preparing or gearing up for new regulations. I think underpinning all of that, Mark, is probably a much better sort of data architecture, right? I think companies have developed these good data systems for climate, more formal governance, clearer ownership, etc. So I think that's a really positive trend. I think where perhaps you asked about like weak spots, I think a persistent weak spot probably, which a lot of the audience will recognize is scope 3 emissions, right? So, so emissions in the wider value chain, which for many companies is actually the vast majority of their footprint, right? And I think that's not surprising, right? I think we all know it's super hard, right? It's sort of, these are emissions that aren't in the company's control. It could be suppliers, product use, right? Investments if you're a financial firm. And And these often sit with different suppliers, different third parties, right? Could be in different countries. And it's hard to gather up that data, right? I think because of that, a lot of Scope 3 data that we see, at least what's reported, still relies on estimates and assumptions. Those assumptions can change over time. But I would say companies are improving in that space too. I think companies have been doing a lot, whether it's building supplier engagement or updating the procurement and so on. I think, and also gearing up for regulations that will require Scope 3 disclosure. So it's still a work in progress on some of these more complex climate metrics. But as a whole, I think climate reporting is quite mature and quite robust. And I think the next frontier is probably sort of bringing that extra level of auditability and assurance to it all.
Super helpful context. Just for any listeners who may not be as familiar with greenhouse gas GHG protocol, Scope 1 are the emissions that the company themselves are putting out into the atmosphere. Scope 2 are the inferred emissions for the energy that the company purchases and uses in its environment. And Scope 3 is kind of everything else, right? It's from the beginning of time, the beginning of the life cycle, and the suppliers, all the way through end of use and the customers. That's all captured in Scope 3. And so that's what makes it so hard, as you mentioned. Also, it probably should be noted that right now the GHG protocol, which is the organization that put out Scope 1, 2, and 3 definitions and guidance, is actually rethinking some of the aspects. And so we'll see how that all falls out, whether it gets easier, more difficult, or both. Another question for you, this is more personal for me. I like to describe my role at the Responsible Business Center as promoting responsible reporting. And I think about all forms of corporate communications to investors when I think about that, whether it's financial, sustainability, or some other communication channel. And I guess I'm wondering, does that resonate with you? And how do you think about the different forms and channels of corporate communication?
It does resonate, Mark. And I think it's a really helpful and really smart way, I think, to look at it, and a really helpful lens. And we've actually had a lot of discussions recently where I think, as we all know, right, corporate reporting is, how to put it right, it is fragmented across many channels, right? And some of the, some are very obvious, like the financial filings, the SEC reports, sustainability reports, proxy statements, etc. But also websites, press releases, social media, right? And I think, obviously, a lot of these channels are owned by different teams, right? Legal might be involved somewhere, sustainability on the sustainability report, investor relations, right? But I think if you're an external audience, you don't necessarily experience that way, right? They're all just the corporate voice. And I think what we've been tracking a lot recently, I think what's really interesting to me is this perhaps matters now more than ever, because with the help of AI and other technologies, it's actually now a lot easier to assemble a company's body of communications, right? I think we do live in a world where it's like investors or activists or plaintiffs, right, can quickly compare language across years, right? And look at, is there inconsistencies between what was said in that annual report, what was said in that ESG report, which is probably a new trend, or at least an intensified trend, right? So I would argue, and hopefully I think you agree, given everything you're involved in, that responsible reporting, you said, probably matters more now than ever, right? And I think big questions about how do you govern communications, right? How do you have consistency? How do you have context? How do you have discipline across channels, right? Big challenge. And I only see that getting sharper as AI develops and more people are harnessing it for this kind of purpose.
Yeah, in a prior life, I used to manage a team of 20, 25 analysts that would have to dig and try to read all these different forms of communication to find inconsistencies and see if the story being told by management teams in their earnings calls and on their website actually matched up to the story being told by the regulatory filings. And that was a much less of a technology push. It was much more of a human and labor intensive type of work that had to be done to see that. And now, as you're mentioning, some of those things AI can help you evaluate, and some still you need some humans in the loop to figure it out. But it is an evolving type of thing, and it makes it all the more important for, in my mind, companies to not think of these different communication channels as siloed. And to that end, I'm wondering if you're seeing over years, probably over the last number of years, are you seeing sustainability reporting becoming a little bit more like financial reporting with stronger systems, controls, assurance expectations, or are there limits to the analogy to financial reporting?
Great question. I think yes. I think yes. Seeing it becoming more like financial reporting in some really important ways, but probably don't want to overstate the analogy. But I think yes. I think when I look at sort of the manner in which sustainability reporting is becoming more regulated, and there's as you know, there's a whole patchwork of regulations out there, Mark, that some companies are subject to more than others, but also I think more controlled, more data driven, right? I think more subject to assurance. We have a lot of, I think, interesting data that shows more and more companies every year disclosing the use of external assurance to verify for example, their emissions data and so on. And I think behind the scenes, obviously, companies are then to do that. They're building processes that do look a bit like financial reporting, right? When it comes to ownership structures and internal controls and sign-off procedures and so on. And regulation, I think, is such a key driver of this. I just wouldn't push it all the way, because I think as we kind of spoke about earlier, we were talking about scope 3 emissions. I think sustainability data still depends on some estimates, right? And then the methodologies are evolving, and there is perhaps some subjective judgments in there, but definitely is a process that's underway, I think, and one of the dimensions of that, I think, is also a closer coming together of sustainability and finance. And we definitely hear sometimes anecdotally that there are a lot closer relationships between the sustainability function and the finance function than we might have seen in prior years for the kind of reasons we spoke about. So, it's interesting watching this evolve in real time, and it's interesting to reflect on where it will end up and how far it will go.
Yeah, your history background makes me think that maybe you'll appreciate this thought process. At least in this country, the SEC promulgated Securities Act of 1933 and 1934, which really is the foundation of modern financial reporting, and supplemented by Sarbanes-Oxley about 25 years ago. And so there's been, say, 90 years of maturation of financial reporting, right? Building up to all the infrastructure that you have to have today to do your financial reporting, whether it's quarterly or semi-annually, and that's a whole other topic. But when you think about sustainability reporting, as compared to the 90 years, is probably 90 months or 90, in some cases, 90 weeks of actual infrastructure and maturation in the sustainability reporting. So we are seeing I agree with you. I think we're seeing at least some migration towards some of the controls and things that you might see in financial reporting. When I first started doing this 6, 7, 8 years ago, I would routinely hear about huge companies that had big sustainability reports, and their levels of controls were an email from one person to another around the world saying, "Where'd you get this number?" "Oh, Vinny told me." "Perfect. Check." We don't get that as much anymore, and certainly that won't survive any assurance expectations.
No, and I just sort of I think it's wonderful to put it in that longer history, because I think it does also underscore that this is a relatively new discipline as well, right? And I think that's only going to continue to go. As you were talking, I was thinking about some of the target setting, right? I think a lot of companies have big climate targets, right? Would be net zero by X year, right? A lot of those were set not necessarily with much sort of data behind them, right? There were perhaps aspirational targets to then be figured out. I think now we are seeing a lot more like linkage of sort of that target setting to like capital allocation and financial planning and breaking down. And I think that's a really positive trend, right? I think it's much less glamorous, and it's more sort of the hard nuts and bolts. But I think that is a maturing, and I think we'll continue to see that happening in different ways within the discipline, which I think is a positive trend for sure.
So let's go from maturing and maybe the teenage years of sustainability reporting to something that is very immature and nascent just in the last couple of years, and that's AI. So let's talk a little bit about artificial intelligence. And I really loved your recent report on AI governance it was called From Principles to Practice, Governing AI in the Corporation. Because it looks at how large companies are putting AI governance into practice. And so what prompted that research now? What were you seeing that sort of spoke to you that said, we really need to put something together on this?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we can't have a podcast discussion without talking about AI, right, Mark? It just wouldn't be right, but we have to, because how could you avoid it? And I think, we started to about how I'm in I sit within the governance and sustainability center at the conference board. I think AI has been sort of moving up our agenda for the last few years, right? I think has really in tandem with it moving up the business and policy agenda, right? And so quickly AI moved, I think, from being, sort of a new shiny thing to actually starting to be integrated into the business. And for our members, you know, our the companies we work with, whether they're corporate governance leaders, sustainability leaders, or even citizenship leaders, this has become the appetite here is huge, right? To really understand sort of how do we build this, right? How do we govern AI at scale? How do we manage risks? How do we oversee AI use? How do we understand and do something about AI's broader societal impacts, right? These are all the kind of big questions we're grappling with, right? So I think recognizing that we've been active for a while, right? We've been convening executives in off the record discussions. We've been doing disclosure analysis, and we did recently, and this led to the piece you mentioned, we did at the start of the year a survey of 130 executives across kind of ESG executives, really across governance, sustainability, and CSR as well. So that was really the impetus, right? And I think we've recognized that the companies have been facing these familiar governance problems, and the research was really, we tried to get into the surface of these issues a little bit, really understand where companies are, where they're heading, what comes next, you know, and then it's such a fast moving space that, what comes next is suddenly what's just happened. But I think hopefully we've brought, some practical insights to a very complex space.
I think you did. And that leads to the next question, which is a lot of companies have AI principles, but your report focuses on moving from those principles to actually practice. And so what does that shift actually look like inside a company?
Yeah. So part of the framing was, I think, that just as recently as about a year ago, it felt like there was such an emphasis on developing and articulating principles, right? That we will be fair, we will be transparent, we will be accountable, you know, we will ensure human oversight, security, etc. And those principles really matter. And I think that's a really important step that companies have to go through, right, in their AI governance journey. But they're also clearly only the starting point, right? And I think the harder question then becomes sort of, what do those mean, right? How do you translate those? What do they mean inside a company, right? On an average day when someone wants to deploy an AI tool or someone wants to use particular data sets, right? So I think we are in the midst of this transition at many companies from principles to practice, right? I think that means different things to different companies, right? Different companies are obviously at different stages of their AI journey. They have different kind of relationships with AI, but I think talk about some sort of broader learnings. I think the first step is visibility, right? I think companies need an inventory of AI use cases because you can't govern what you can't see, right? And that includes those tools that are being developed internally as well as what you're procuring or what's already in existing software and so on. Then I think the next step is risk and risk tiering. And I think AI risk is such a fascinating area, right? And clearly not every AI use case needs the same level of scrutiny, right? You know, I think if an internal tool you're using to draft reports is obviously very different from something you're using in hiring or lending or healthcare, right? So I think it's sort of understanding that risk matrix and how you appropriately govern. And then I think after that, it's accountability, right? Who actually owns this within the organization, right? Who reviews data? Who decides when human oversight is required? And it's only all these steps sound quite simple when I say them, right? But they're actually just so extremely complex, particularly in large global organizations, because there's so much AI is moving so fast and there's so much often we can't fully see. And so much is still up for debate, I think, which is making for a really interesting time. And also I think keeping a lot of governance leaders up at night for sure.
Yeah. I think I want to get into the risks in a minute, but as you were talking, I also heard you say accountability and where this stuff is owned. And I think I want to get a little more of a double click on that, right? Because where does AI governance belong organizationally? Is it a board issue? Is it a management committee issue? Legal compliance, IT, cybersecurity, all of the above? And maybe this is part of the maturation conversation.
Yeah, I think it's probably all of the above, right? But playing out in a lot of different complex ways, right? And that doesn't necessarily mean everyone owns it equally, right? Or that therefore, because it's everyone, it's vague and who knows, right? Who actually makes the decision? I think there is a lot of layers to this, and you got to start at the board. The board has to oversee AI as a strategic risk and governance issue, right? That doesn't mean they're managing every individual thing that's AI related, right? But they have to have some level of oversight and they need to be asking the right questions, right? I think then at sort of the CEO, C-suite management level, clearly you need some kind of enterprise level structure, right? And that's going to look differently at different firms. That we've definitely seen in some of our data and some of our convenings a trend towards having some kind of cross-functional AI group, right? Whatever you call it, right? The AI council, the AI governance committee. And think there's some obvious people who need to be sat on that, right? Like technology. I don't know how you can not have the tech guys in there. Legal and compliance, right? Have to be there, I think. IT and cybersecurity. They all seem very obvious, right? But I would argue that you need a bunch of other people too, right? And how can you not have HR in there? Given how AI affects hiring and workforce planning, you can make a strong argument, as much as I think not many companies are doing it yet, for sustainability to have a strong voice in that group, given some of the environmental and social implications. Procurement, I think, because of many of these risks are actually coming from third-party vendors. So that then in turn raises a question about, at what point do you just have everyone from the organization involved? But clearly I think companies need to manage and avoid extremes, right? You clearly can't treat AI as just an IT issue, but you also need to avoid creating this sprawling governance process that slows everything down. So I think it's having the right people in the room, having the right structures, having the right vehicles, and then having at the top of the organization clear oversight of strategy.
Sounds very reminiscent in many ways to the ESG discussion we were having a couple of years ago of where does ESG fit in the organization as well. And is there a board committee? Is it across the board? Is it management and how? But the things that you're saying makes me think that in any of these emerging areas, making sure you've got a cross-functional interdisciplinary perspectives involved in all these things is going to be super helpful, because none of them reside particularly well in only one organization, one part of the organization. So let's get into the AI risks. So what are the biggest AI risks that companies are recognizing right now? I think of a million of them, right? Cybersecurity, regulatory exposure, model bias, intellectual property, reputation, workforce disruption, data privacy, environmental impact. Like, how do you get your hands around all of this?
Right. I mean, that list just goes on and on, right? And it's I actually think it's such an interesting area of discussion right now, just about sort of how do you even come up with like an AI risk taxonomy, right? And to what extent is AI risk a separate category? And to what extent is it just amplifying some of those other categories that you just said, right, Mark? I think that's a debate that's probably going to continue on, I think, for a while as companies still figure out some of the processes here. I'd say from a corporate perspective, and, we've seen this in some of our benchmarking data, I'd say companies are probably right now, I think they're seeing a lot of these risks, right? And the ones they're prioritizing are, I think, the kind of immediate ones, right? The immediate enterprise risks, such as cybersecurity, data, regulatory compliance, etc. Right? And actually in the survey, we mentioned, cybersecurity was by some margin, actually the most consistently identified top AI risk by the audiences that we spoke to. And I think that makes a lot of sense, right? I think it's immediate. It's familiar. It's already sort of there. I think, we've been a lot of focus on cybersecurity in the last few years. And I think a lot of people are starting to get quite concerned about the way in which AI, from a cyber perspective, sort of potentially expands the attack surface, right? Can maybe make fraud and phishing and malicious code a lot easier to generate, and therefore a lot easier to attack companies, right? And I think there's a lot of anxiety in that space, right? So cybersecurity right now, big area of focus, but seeing other areas rising up too. I think privacy and data protection, consistent issue given focus on data and how do you ever truly know what data is being entered into systems, right? Regulatory compliance is moving up fast, I think, as the fragmented regulatory landscape continues to take shape, both in the US and globally. But there's less commonly recognized risks too, including some of the ones you mentioned, right? Around workforce, around environmental risks, around social. And while they may not be fully on the agenda yet, I think they will continue to capture attention and gradually make their way into these corporate risk discussions.
Any view on how companies are disclosing these kinds of risks in their corporate reporting these days?
Yeah. We did a big project on this last year. For me, it was a really interesting piece of work, right? Where quite a simple project. We simply looked at, the S&P 500, right? So big, large cap companies. And we looked at what they're saying in the risk factors section of their annual report, right? So for those who don't know, this is, common standardized practice for companies to disclose their material risks in their annual 10K SEC report, along with potentially some ways in which they mitigate, right? To some extent, that's a lot of its legal boilerplate, but I think it is an interesting perspective on what companies are seeing and how they're thinking about risks, right? And to give you, I think, a really interesting stat, as recently as 3 years ago, it was about 12% of S&P 500 companies had an AI-related risk in that section. Last year was 83%, right? So very, that's in the space of a few years, AI risk, I guess, has become mainstream. And I think what you're now going to start seeing is companies with several AI related risks in that section, right? Talking whether it's about cybersecurity, about regulations, about workforce, about privacy and so on. So companies are definitely starting to say a lot more about AI risk, at least in certain places, right? And I think the next stage is probably just going to be continue to get more specific in those, as well as perhaps being more specific on how they're governing them and how they're mitigating them, right? But AI risk here to stay as a top corporate concern.
Super helpful context. And now I wanted to touch on some of that intersection you were alluding to between AI and sustainability and environmental impact, right? So let's get into that a little bit. You've written about AI and environmental sustainability, and I kind of like the distinction you make between sustainable AI and AI for sustainability. And can you walk our listeners through those two lenses?
Yeah, sure. So the background here is, we spoke earlier about some of the work we've been doing in the Governance and Sustainability Center on AI, and we did have some specific work on the intersection of AI and sustainability, and we kind of came at that from two different fronts as much as they overlap. One of which is sustainable AI, right? So actually looking at the environmental footprint of AI, right? And really that typically means the data center build out, right? Which I think we all know is sort of scaling more and more every day. And the electricity use, the water use, as well as some of the more indirect stuff like the electronic waste and hardware and so on. So I think that's becoming, and that it's interesting in watching that happen in real time, how that seems to be becoming more and more of a major concern from a political aspect, from a business aspect, every day really. And there's a whole depth of analysis there on how do you potentially try and mitigate some of these demands. At the same time, they're also looking at AI for sustainability, right? And we look at these as two lenses, right? Which is at the same time, I guess the AI scaling is having an environmental impact. AI itself can be used to some extent to potentially improve environmental outcomes, right? Whether that's deploying AI to be more efficient in energy use or optimizing buildings, climate risk modeling, product design, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So sort of interesting tension there, right? Because I think the tension is both of these can be true at the same time, right? AI on the one hand can be increasing environmental pressure, and at the same time, potentially helping companies do something about some of their environmental challenges, whether it's waste, emissions, inefficiency, etc. So I guess when we promote this view, I guess we're trying to sort of not say that AI is inherently good or bad for sustainability. I think it's trying to look at the specific use cases and whether we can use AI in a way to create environmental value that justifies some of that footprint, right? And that's going to look different at different companies, right? For tech companies, obviously this is a highly material question because they're building the infrastructure. For perhaps the broader universe of enterprise users, the footprint might be smaller directly, but it still matters indirectly because they're still only the ones who are using these tools, right? And therefore part of their scope 3, to go back to that concept we introduced earlier. So I think it's a really complex area, but it's a really fascinating area. And I only expect attention to grow here from a variety of angles.
I just think that's such a helpful distinction and framing so that it doesn't lead to the polarization we were talking about some earlier, right? And just being able to sort of describe this as, well, there are some negatives, there are some positives, and it really depends on how companies are using it and depending on how they're deploying it. And we could try to look toward models that minimize the risks and the negative impacts and maximize the positive impacts. So I think that that's super helpful framing and just having a great impact on the conversation overall. And we got to get into data centers, and you mentioned them. Data centers are getting all the attention because of the power and water demand. So how should companies think about the environmental footprint of AI, especially if they're not even technology companies, but they are increasingly using those kinds of AI tools?
Yeah, I mean, you're so right. We can't avoid this, can we? And I think what's so interesting about the data center story, right, is it's not just an infrastructure story anymore, right? It's a political flashpoint, right? It's an environmental flashpoint. And particularly when we talk about power demand and water use and local community impacts, right? I think it's still evolving, but clearly is becoming quite complex. And I think it's becoming more and more of a political issue every day. And as you said, for the tech companies, right? For the so-called hyperscalers, right? Who are building out or financing or driving this build out, this is obviously a material issue directly, right? It's their footprint, right? It should be added. The tech companies think, constantly experimenting, I think, with quite interesting ways to try and mitigate some of this, whether it's through, some of the water efficiency aspects or even building their own off-grid energy and so on, right? So this is, it's not a simplistic debate and there's a lot going on. For the non-tech companies, which is probably most companies, right? They're not building data centers, right? But they are, I guess, customers of data centers when they're using, their frontier generative AI models. It's complex, right? And I think companies need to, and particularly sustainability leaders, need to tread a bit carefully here, right? Because on the one hand, they need to avoid just treating this as irrelevant, right? It's not our problem. It's not our data centers, whatever. But also you need to avoid overstating it, as a material climate issue without the evidence, right? And I think for most of these companies, that footprint is going to show up it's going to show up in their procurement, in their scope 3 emissions, in their tech strategy, in their data. So I think the non-tech companies need to perhaps think through kind of what tools are they using, for what purpose, through which vendors, right? And what is their footprint? And then maybe ask some of these cloud providers and AI vendors some harder questions, maybe about, what energy is being used, how's water being managed, how efficient are the data centers, and ask for more data, right? And ask for more disclosure data. I think that will help perhaps make it more visible just how significant the AI related environmental footprint is. But it's still a complex area, and definitely anecdotally, we hear from a lot of sustainability leaders still unsure how to approach this issue, right? And how to frame it in comparison to some of their broader environmental challenges, right? Whether it's around decarbonization and so on. So still a work in progress, I think.
I can see that. And I think that makes a lot of sense given where we're at. And it is difficult, and you might not have a whole lot of data. You might just have intuition as to how it's falling out and how it's impacting, but you might not actually have hard data to support the conclusion one way or the other. On the opportunity side, I imagine and hope you've seen some anecdotes of where AI is actually helping companies improve sustainability performance, and not just reporting, but maybe operational outcomes.
Yeah, it does. And actually, we have some, I think, really interesting data on this, where in the same survey we spoke about earlier, we had a section that was just for sustainability heads. It was quite interesting because we asked 2 questions, right? The first one we asked is, where are you currently using AI for sustainability related stuff, right? And we also asked, where do you see the biggest value for AI in the next few years, right? So I think there was no big surprises for it's being used now, right? I think it was really sort of reporting, disclosure, carbon accounting, right? These seem obvious use cases right now, right? Because AI is great at analyzing data and collecting data and drafting reports, right? And I think AI can really be a huge help here on the reporting and disclosure side with, human oversight, of course, and human review, and not just automating the whole thing, right? I think it is useful, but when we looked at the data from where our sustainability heads saw the biggest opportunities in the years to come, it was clearly not the biggest prize. And they cited much more ambitious use cases, I think, where it's around, AI optimizing energy efficiency in buildings, right? In improving manufacturing, improving visibility into supply chains, enhancing climate risk analysis, which is very sophisticated. I think AI is a real big help there. And even, some quite interesting cases that we're starting to see take shape in real life, sort of around, using AI in product design, right? To identify or even sort of help create these lower impact materials and reduce packaging and improve circularity and so on. So I think there's a lot of excitement in the sustainability field at the ways in which AI could be used in the years to come to, generate really meaningful, whether it's like meaningful reductions in energy and waste and pollution. I think there's still probably some work to be done in actually, how do you really advance that work forward? How do you upskill the sustainability team to use the technology effectively, right? I think that's still a work in progress in the same way it is in all kinds of functions, right? But I think it's coming, and I think AI sustainability value in the long run is probably going to come less from, writing better reports and more from running better operations, right? And I think it's exciting as an observer. I hope we can get there, and I hope we can leverage these technologies for positive sustainability impact.
Yeah, me too. Obviously, when you hear about things like potentially new materials and new products and improved efficiencies in terms of machinery and all that kinds of stuff, and how do you design buildings, et cetera, that all sounds fantastic and very inspiring. So hopefully this will continue, this trend. And I guess I wanted to bring it back to the students that I see at Fordham all the time, and sort of the young accounting students that I talk to regularly, who are a little worried about efficiency, meaning difficulty in jobs. and less need for jobs. And so for students listening who are interested in sustainability or governance or responsible business, what skills do you think they should be building now? And I think about data literacy or regulatory fluency, communication, ethics, systems training, as this is evolving, and no need to hold you to this because it's going to change consistently over the next couple of years. But what are you thinking about? What are you hearing? And what would you recommend?
Yeah, it's a great question, and do reflect on this a lot, because I think to your point, this is this is an interesting time in the labor market as a whole, and obviously an interesting time to be entering the labor market, right? And a lot of perhaps some of our assumptions are under challenge, and there's a lot of uncertainty about where certain professions will, or certain functions, or certain disciplines will evolve, right? But I think there are some core skills I think that definitely students can and should be building, and yeah, I think you can't get away from the data literacy and analytical fluency, right? I think given these AI tools are here to stay, I don't think we all need to become data scientists, right? But I think we do need to build some general familiarity with data, what it can prove and what it can't prove, right? And when claims are running ahead of the evidence, I think any grounding there you can build for yourself will come in very useful wherever you take your career. I think more broadly, particularly if you're interested in, corporate sustainability, corporate governance, responsible business, I think that business and regulatory fluency, I think, is really helpful, right? It's as we sort of been speaking through this discussion, right, Mark, there's a lot of disclosure rules, a lot of regulation, a lot of policy assumptions that are all shaping this field and will continue to shape this field, right? And it's hard to stay up to date, but I think any sort of fluency you can build there, any kind of, I guess, broad view will be coming very helpful, because no doubt a few years from now, there'll be a whole new raft of policy stuff that we didn't see coming, right? My final recommendation, I think this is particularly perhaps useful for sustainability minded folks, is just being able to perhaps be a translator. What I mean by that is, being able to move between like the technical expertise, which is really important and will remain really important, but also being able to talk, in the language of external stakeholders and internal stakeholders and investors and employees, right? And law and regulation. I think being able to explain complex issues enough to different audiences is really, really valuable. And I think some business acumen helps there also. Those are probably quite broad recommendations, right? But I hopefully they are quite practical. And I definitely say don't chase labels like ESG, right? Or responsible AI, they'll come and they'll go, but build durable capabilities, right? Whether it's in communications and judgment and system thinking and data. I think they'll serve you well wherever you take your career.
Oh man, I couldn't agree more. I think the points that you break, especially around some of those soft skills that probably don't get enough attention in the classroom, and that ability to translate between something technical to something that's much more accessible by a wider audience or a different audience, I think that that's huge. And whatever the case might be for your career, there's always going to be things that are deeply, deeply technical that need to be explained to the non-technical. And I couldn't agree more that having that skill set of translating and communicating and being able to deal with other humans and explain to them what's going on is going to be critical, right? Because like you said, in the next 3 years, something else that's completely unforeseen right now is going to come up. And that's the other thing that I tell students, and that you implied, might as well make it explicit, is that don't think about your career over a 30-year landscape and try to decide now what you want to do for the next 30 years, right? Just try to think about, what do I want to do for the next 3 years? And enhance my skills in these different areas that'll just lead to more opportunities as the world keeps evolving quickly.
Yeah, I love that last point, Mark. I think that's always been valid, and now perhaps is more valid than ever. Yeah, it's sort of, you can have these big visions for where you want to end up, and I think that's really great, right? You need to have like a goal and be able to visualize it. But I guess where we started this conversation, right, talking about how career paths are often non-linear and opportunities come and you take them, right, and you don't necessarily know where they're going to lead. I think you have to be nimble, have to be agile, and therefore, maybe focusing on what you really want to accomplish in the next few years is a really helpful foundation to do that, I think.
That's a perfect callback to how we started the conversation. Look, Andrew, this has been really great. Thank you so much for joining me and for sharing all the great thinking that you've been doing in the realms of sustainability and AI and the intersections between the two. It's just truly a fascinating discussion. And thanks to everyone listening to People Behind the Impact. If you enjoyed this conversation, please take a moment to subscribe to the series, write a quick review, and share it with others who are interested in responsible business, sustainability, reporting, and leadership. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time.